Church History in Plain Language, 5th edition, by Bruce L. Shelley. Chapter 29. Another Man at Manresa, the Catholic Reformation. In 1521, the year that Martin Luther stood before Emperor Charles V at the Diet of Worms, a young Spanish nobleman was fighting on the emperor's borderlands against the invading French at Pamplona. A cannonball shattered one of his legs. During a long, painful convalescence, he turned, out of boredom, to two popular inspirational works, one on the lives of the saints, and the other on the life of Christ. With these, his long process of conversion began. Months later, at the Benedictine Abbey of Montserrat, he exchanged his gentleman's clothes for rough pilgrim's garb, and dedicated his sword and dagger to the shrine's Black Virgin. For nearly a year, in a little town called Manresa, 30 miles north of Barcelona, he gave himself to austerity, begging door to door, wearing a garbed girdle, fastened for days on end. For months he endured the terrible depressions of the mystic's dark night of the soul, even contemplating suicide at one point. But what followed was the mystic's singular reward, an immense breakthrough to spiritual enlightenment. In a wave of ecstatic illumination one day at the river Cordoner, the wounded nobleman, Ignatius Loyola, became, in his own words, another man. Loyola, 1491 to 1556, transformed his rebirth at Manresa to a plan for spiritual discipline, a military manual for special forces at the service of the Pope. The result was the Society of Jesus, the Jesuits, the greatest single force in Catholicism's campaign to recapture the spiritual domains seized by Protestantism. How did the Church of Rome respond to the Protestant challenge? It didn't. Not immediately. But when it finally realized the seriousness of the revolt, it called upon its spiritual warriors. It convened a new military council, and it reformed the machinery of the papal office. Faced by the rebellion of almost half of Europe, Catholicism rolled back the tide of Protestantism until by the end of the 16th century, Protestantism was limited roughly to the northern third of Europe, as it is today. Some historians have interpreted the Catholic Reformation as a counterattack against Protestantism. Others have described it as a genuine revival of Catholic piety with few thoughts of Protestantism. The truth is, the movement was both a counter-reformation, as Protestants insist, and a Catholic Reformation, as Catholics argue. Its roots run back to forces before Luther's time, but the form it took was largely determined by the Protestant attack. Return to the spiritual. Strange as it may be, the mystical experience was a large part of Catholicism's recovery. The 16th century produced a remarkable variety of Catholic saints. English lawyer and statesman Thomas More, cheerful and imaginative missionary to the Calvinists Francis of Sales, somber reforming Archbishop of Milan Charles Borromeo, rapturous Spanish mystic Teresa of Avila, and most influential of all, Spanish soldier of Christ, Ignatius Loyola. Even before Luther posted his thesis on the church door, a distinguished and aristocratic group at Rome had formed a pious brotherhood called the Orator of Divine Love. Their guiding belief was that the reformation of the church and society begins within the individual soul. The Orator was never large in number, perhaps 50, yet it had enormous influence. It stimulated reform in the older monastic orders and contributed leaders to the Church of Rome as it laid plans for a general council to deal with internal reform and the Protestant heresy. Among the members of the Orator, who later emerged as significant figures were Jacopo Sodalito, who debated with Calvin, Reginald Pole, who tried under Bloody Mary to turn England back to Rome, and Gian Pietro Carafa, who became Pope Paul IV. Throughout the 1520s and 1530s, however, the Church of Rome took no significant steps toward reform. The question is why? Why was she so slow to respond to the Protestant challenge? One simple answer is politics. Emperor Charles V and the popes fought a running battle over the calling of a general council that stretched over 2 decades. Luther had called for a council of the church so early as 1518. The idea gained the support of the German princes and the emperor, but the popes feared such an assembly. They remembered too well the councils at Constance and Basel. They also knew that many in Germany had in mind a council without a pope. Equally important, the popes in the 1520s and 1530s were preoccupied with secular and political affairs. Clement VII, 1523 to 1534, is a prominent example. He regarded concern for the papal states in Italy as a supreme law, and his passion for papal political fortunes drew him into an alliance with France against Charles V, leader of the Habsburg interests in Italy. The Pope's treachery and disloyalty enraged Charles, and he threatened Clement with a trial before a general council unless he broke his alliance with Francis I, King of France. To show the Pope he meant business, Charles ordered his troops to march on Rome. As it turned out, he got more than he planned for. The commanders of his troops were killed. As a result, the rough and undisciplined Spanish and German mercenaries were leaderless when they stormed Rome on May 6, 1527. Their pillaging, plundering, and murdering in the Eternal City lasted for weeks. The Pope took refuge in the castle of St. Angelo, but finally had to surrender and endure half a year of harsh imprisonment. Many considered the sack of Rome a terrible visitation by God, a clear call to repentance and change in the worldly papacy. No serious reform came until Pope Paul III, 1534 to 1549, ascended the papal throne. Paul appeared to be a most unlikely candidate for spiritual leadership. He had 3 illegitimate sons and a daughter, 4 striking reminders of his pursuit of pleasure. The sack of Rome, however, seems to have sobered him. He realized that the time had come for reform to begin in the house of God. He started where he felt a change of heart was most urgently needed, in the College of Cardinals. He appointed to the college a number of champions of reform. Among them were leaders in the oratory of divine love, Sadoleto, Pole, and Carafa. Paul then appointed 9 of the new cardinals to a reform commission. The head of the commission was another former member of the orator, Gasparo Contarini, a peacemaker by temperament. Contarini stood for reconciliation with the Protestants and advocated a return to the faith of the apostles. After a wide-ranged study of conditions in the Church of Rome, the Commission issued in 1537 a formal report, Advice Concerning the Reform of the Church. Disorder in the Church, the report said, could be traced directly to the need for reform. The papal office was too secular. Both popes and cardinals needed to give more attention to spiritual matters and stop flirting with the world. Bribery in high places, abuses of indulgences, evasions of church law, prostitution in Rome, these and other offenses must cease. Call for General Council. Pope Paul took action on a few of these items, but his most significant response was a call for a General Council of the Church. After intense negotiations, he agreed with the emperor on a location for the assembly, a town in northern Italy under imperial control called Trent. Even then, however, no council assembled for years because Francis I did everything in his power to prevent such a gathering. In his passion for leadership of Europe, he feared a council would only strengthen Charles's hand. Francis even stopped to inciting the Turks against the emperor. Two wars between Francis and Charles delayed the opening of a council until 1545, almost 3 decades after Luther's thesis appeared. By 1545, Rome was under the spell of a new austerity. Reform was on the rise. The immoralities of Paul's younger days were no longer acceptable behavior. The Pope's new rigor was apparent in the institution of the Roman Inquisition and in the index of prohibited books, the reading of which caused any Catholic to risk damnation. All the books of the Reformers were listed, as well as Protestant Bibles. For a long time, merely to possess one of these banned books in Spain was punishable by death. The index was kept up to date until 1959 and was finally abolished by Pope Paul VI. Ignatius Loyola. It was this city, a new militant Rome, and this Pope Paul III who approved Ignatius Loyola's new Society of Jesus. These daring soldiers of Christ promised the Pope that they would go wherever he might send them, whether to the Turks or to the New World, or to the Lutherans or to others, be they infidel or faithful. They said it and they meant it, for the Jesuits were a fitting likeness of their founding general. As a boy, Ignatius had left the gloomy castle of Loyola near the Pyrenees to enter the court of his father's noble friend. He had grown into little more than an engaging playboy, spending his days playing military games or reading popular chivalrous romances, his nights pursuing less noble adventures with local girls. But all that was before Ignatius met God at Manresa. Martin Luther emerged from his spiritual struggle convinced that the human will is enslaved, that no one can save himself. God and God alone must deliver him. Loyola came out of his struggle believing that both God and Satan are eternal to oneself, and a person has the power to choose between them. By the disciplined use of his imagination, a person can strengthen his will so as to choose God and his ways. One of Loyola's spiritual exercises, for example, aimed to make the horrors of hell real. Hear in imagination the shrieks and groans and blasphemous shouts against Christ our Lord and all the saints. Smell in imagination the fumes of sulfur and the stench of filth and corruption. Taste in imagination all the bitterness of tears and melancholy and growing conscience. Feel in imagination the heat of the flames that play on and burn the souls. Same technique, of course, could be used to represent the beauties of the Nativity or the glories of heaven. By proper discipline, the imagination could strengthen the will and teach it to cooperate with God's grace. For Ignatius personally, surrender to the will of God meant more education. He entered a school in Barcelona to sit with boys less than half his age to study Latin, then threw himself into a dizzying year of courses at the University of Alcala. Out of it came his conviction that learning must be organized to be useful. The idea eventually grew into the Jesuits' famed plan of studies, which measured out heavy but manageable doses of classics, humanities, and sciences. Ignatius became such a fervent evangelist that the Inquisition imprisoned and examined him more than once about his life, teaching, and theology. Perturbed, he left for Paris, where he spent 7 years at the university, became Master Ignatius, and gathered around him the first of his permanent champions, Peter Faber, Diego Lainez, Alfonso Salmeron, Simon Rodriguez, Nicolas Bobadilla, and, above all, young Spanish nobleman Francis Xavier. Ignatius shared with them his remarkable program for sainthood, his spiritual exercise, a distillation of his religious experiences during and following his conversion. The exercises prescribed 4 weeks of meditations, beginning with sin, death, judgment, and hell, and then moving on to Christ's life, death, and resurrection. Ignatius intended a path to spiritual perfection, rigorous examination of conscience, penance, and a resolute amnesia about guilt once the spiritual pilgrim confronted God's forgiveness. The exercises became the basis of every Jesuit spirituality. Later popes also prescribed them for candidates for ordination. The Catholic retreats applied them to lay groups. In his portrait of the artist as a young man, James Joyce describes his young hero, Stephen Dedalus, reduced to horror by a sermon on hell. A wave of fire swept through his body. Flames burst forth from his skull. After he had gone to confession, however, the past was past. That is just the way Ignatius planned it. Send no one away dejected, Loyola wrote. God asks nothing impossible. Thus his followers became the great apostles of the possible. Profiles of faith. Teresa of Avila, 1515 to 1582. A young nun in Avila, Spain, struggled for years with life-threatening illness and self-torture. She found scholastic Christianity unfulfilling and began to pray by envisioning herself with Jesus when he was alone, such as when he was in Gethsemane. Eventually she had a life-changing vision of the dying Jesus, which she considered a second conversion that filled her with love. Disturbed by the spiritual laxity of the convents she knew, she received the Pope's blessing to found new ones and started 16 Reformed Carmelite convents throughout Spain. Her deeper legacy was her writing about the life of meditation, prayer, and union with Christ. The Interior Castle is her most analytical description of the stages toward mystic marriage with Christ. She enlisted a monk, Jean de la Cruz, John of the Cross, to start Reformed Carmelite monasteries. John authored the classic The Dark Night of the Soul. The Society of Jesus. In 1540, Pope Paul III approved the Little Society of Jesus as a new religious order. In Ignatius's metaphor, they were to be chivalrous soldiers of Jesus, mobile, versatile, ready to move anywhere and perform any task the Pope assigned. As a recognized order, they added to their earlier vows of poverty and chastity the traditional vow of obedience to their superiors and a fourth vow expressing their special loyalty to the Pope. They gave command to a superior general elected for life. Their choice for the first general was Ignatius. The aim of the order was simple: to restore the Roman Catholic Church to the position of spiritual power and worldly influence it had held 3 centuries before under Innocent III. Everything was subordinated to the Church of Rome because Ignatius believed firmly that the living Christ resided in the institutional church exclusively. Perhaps the most fascinating feature of the Jesuits was their perilous attempt to live energetically in the world without being of it. Loyola wanted them to be all things to all men, and they nearly succeeded. Their efforts have rallied defenders who assigned them the highest posts in heaven and critics who consigned them to the lower regions of hell. Writing to Thomas Jefferson in 1816, John Adams said, "If ever any congregation of men could merit eternal perdition on earth and in hell, it is the company of Loyola." Whatever their destination, the Jesuits were from their beginning unique. The first generation, under Loyola's zealous leadership, rode full gallop into their new assignments: convert the heathen, reconvert Protestant Europe. Francis Xavier leaped from India to Southeast Asia and Japan, a country that had never before heard the Christian message. More than any others, the Society of Jesus stemmed and sometimes reversed the tide of Protestantism in France, the Low Countries, and Central Europe. When Ignatius died in 1556, his order was nearly 1,000 strong and had dispatched its apostles to 4 continents. No mission in that first generation proved more decisive than the band of Jesuits assigned to the Council of Trent. Only 31 council fathers, led by 3 papal legates, were present for the opening ceremonies of the council. None of them could have guessed that their modest beginning would lead to the most important council between Nicaea 325 and Vatican II, 1962 to 1965. Under the influence of the Jesuits, Trent developed into a powerful weapon of the Counter-Reformation. 2 suave, intelligent, and highly influential members of the society, Diego Lainez and Alfonso Salmerian, guided the agenda more and more toward the correct churchly attitude of the followers of Loyola. The Council Fathers met in 3 main sessions: 1545 to 1547, 1551 to 1552, and 1562 to 1563. Throughout the sessions, the Italians were strongly represented. Other areas, notably France, were significantly underrepresented. Compared to other councils, Trent was never well attended. During the second series of sessions, a number of Protestants were present, but they had little influence. From start to finish, the council reflected the new militant stance of Rome. The shape of modern Catholicism. Everything the Protestant Reformation stood for was vigorously, one could almost say violently, rejected at Trent. The Protestant reformers emphasized justification by faith alone. The council insisted that Christian people must perform good works lest they become lazy and indifferent. Instead of the Protestant concept of external righteousness, by which God counts a person right in his eyes by faith. For Catholics, righteousness was internal, the process by which God imparts righteousness within Christians during the course of their life. Trent emphatically linked justification to the process of becoming righteous, leaving the notion of being declared righteous to be a Protestant heresy. Luther, Calvin, and Grebel stressed salvation by grace alone. The council emphasized grace and human cooperation with God to avoid, in Loyola's terms, the poison that destroys freedom. Pray as though everything depends on God alone, Ignatius advised, but act as though it depended on you alone whether you will be saved. The Protestants taught the religious authority of Scripture alone. The council insisted on the supreme teaching offices of the Roman Church, popes and bishops, as the essential interpreters of the Bible. Thus the Council of Trent guaranteed that modern Roman Catholicism would be governed by the collaboration between God's grace and human efforts. The Pope remained. The 7 sacraments remained. The sacrifice of the Mass remained. Saints, confessions, indulgences remained. The Council's work was unmistakably anti-Protestant. After 4 centuries, we can look back to the Reformation age and see that the religious unity of Western Christendom was permanently shattered. Men and women in Loyola's lifetime did not see that truth. The fact dawned on Europe slowly. Initially, Luther's followers thought him so obviously right that the Catholic Church would inevitably adopt his reforms. Others thought him so obviously wrong that sooner or later he would be burned as a heretic and his moment would wither away. After all, the past was strewn with the corpses of heretics. The point is, both parties, Catholic and Protestant, thought that they represented the one true Catholic Church of Christ, and their enemies a false version of it. That was certainly the spirit of Trent. As time went on, however, the thinking of ordinary people reached almost imperceptibly a second stage. The uneasy, half-conscious conviction grew that the conflict had reached a stalemate. Catholicism could not eradicate the new heresy, and Protestantism could not overthrow Rome. In the second stage, no one welcomed the stalemate status. They only slowly acknowledged it as a fact. The vast majority of people were still convinced that religious truth was identifiable. Truth stood on one side, error on the other. Error meant not only individual damnation, but infection of others and destruction of society. Resistance to the dreadful evil heresy took the form of inquisitions, civil wars, and persecutions. In this ideological warfare, Calvinists and Jesuits led the charge. Each embodied a militant organization called for doctrinal loyalty above and beyond national and political ties. At this stage, almost no one could imagine that truth could lie on both sides of the battlefield, or that both parties could peacefully coexist in the same state, or even on the same continent. The third stage of ongoing religious plurality, based on the full acceptance of religious diversity within a nation, appeared before 1600, only in hints, in the attitudes of mystics, Christian humanists like Erasmus, radical Protestants like the Anabaptists, and practical politicians like Queen Elizabeth of England. Perhaps more powerful still were the political and economic forces that emerged in the newly formed nation-states. These states, with geographic boundaries that included both Protestant and Catholic citizens, would require them to coexist and cooperate. Distinctive beliefs and social practices would be tolerated if they could be transformed to become a matter of private devotion. Feeble as it was, this whisper was the voice of the future. No company of Christians resisted it more doggedly than the Jesuits. Chapter 30. Opening the Rock. Uttermost America and Asia. On Thursday, October 11th, 1492, a new world opened for the Christian faith. On that day, Christopher Columbus, admiral of the ocean sea, viceroy and governor of whatever territory he might discover, sighted sandpipers, green reeds, and finally land in what we call the West Indies. The next morning, Columbus stepped on the island's shore, named it San Salvador, Holy Savior, and took possession of it in the name of King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella of Spain. He offered to the curious natives red caps and glass beads to put around their necks. This gave them such obvious pleasure that Columbus surmised that they could easily be converted to our holy faith by love rather than by force. Historians speak of the next 150 years as the Age of Discovery because during these decades, Europeans planted colonies in the Americas and found new trade routes to the riches of the Far East. In the history of Christianity, we might call these years the Age of Global Expansion, since between 1500 and 1650, Roman Catholic monks and friars carried the gospel to Spanish colonies throughout Latin America and Portuguese ports along the coasts of Africa and Asia. Through all these exhilarating years, Columbus's original alternative troubled Christian missionaries. Should the natives be won to the holy faith by love or by force? At times it was some courageous and selfless Franciscan or Jesuit winning through persevering love. At others it was some troop of ruthless Christian conquerors forcing baptism on natives at the point of the sword. The problem arose because missionaries must always decide what heathenism is. Is it humanity stumbling in uncertain quest of the true God? Or is it humanity organized in hardened resistance to the gospel? Should the Christian ambassador seek the good in heathen religions and use this as a foundation for building a Christian community? Or should he suppress, destroy if necessary, all forms of heathen religion in order to plant the true faith? We can call one approach the policy of adaptation and the other the policy of conquest. The gospel and culture. Adaptation or conquest rests, in turn, under a broader question. How does the gospel relate to culture? The church is often in danger of identifying the gospel with some cultural form in which the faith has found a home. And thus missionaries, assuming their culture was essential to the gospel, failed to adopt to the ways of another people. They felt constrained to insist on only one expression of the faith, theirs. In the age of the apostles, Jewish Christians initially believed devoutly that the Christian faith was identical with Hebrew rites and covenants and Sabbaths. Only when the good news broke free from its Jewish cultural forms was it able to take root in the Greco-Roman world. The same was true when the invading Germanic tribes destroyed many of the institutions of Roman life. The Christian faith had to find new ways to speak effectively to medieval people. The early and high Middle Ages were times of dedicated missionary efforts. During the Middle Ages, however, an important attitude developed among European Christians. The rise of Islam in the 7th century drove a wedge between Christians in Europe and their fellow believers in Asia and Africa. Only a few outposts of Christianity survived in the Islamic countries of North Africa and the Near East. Christianity was confined almost exclusively to Europe. The Crusades were the convulsive attempt of Christian Europe to batter down the barriers of Islam by military force. The long struggle in Spain and Portugal to drive out the Moors, as the Muslims were called there, created an especially militant attitude toward the unbelieving outsider. Because of the wars, conquest and evangelization intertwined. Few minds could recognize a difference. The new age of worldwide missions opened with the era of great discoveries. The Portuguese and Spaniards first turned their ships south to the middle of the 15th century. The French, Dutch, and English soon joined the colonizing venture. Following the west coast of Africa, the Portuguese reached the southern tip of the continent in 1486 and named it the Cape of Good Hope. In 1495, Vasco da Gama continued around Africa in the direction of Asia and first sighted land on the western or Malabar coast of India. It was a spot ideally suited to serve as a base of operations for Portuguese expansion in the Far East. For centuries, in Malabar ports, Arab merchants had picked up spices, gems, ivory, Indian cottons, and Chinese silks, and had shipped them through the Red Sea or the Persian Gulf, then overland to the Mediterranean world. The Portuguese realized that these ports were centers of exchange between the East and the West, the heart of the Eastern trade. In short order, the Portuguese drove the flimsy Arab vessels from the Indian Ocean. They made Goa on the Malabar coast the center of their eastern commercial empire and moved on eastward to plant strategic bases in the Malay archipelago and the Moluccan Islands. By 1516, they had reached China, and by 1543, Japan. The Portuguese, unlike the Spanish, made no attempt to conquer or colonize on a large scale. They had no interest in land, no visions of mining for gold. They wanted a trade monopoly. That meant control of the seas. So Portuguese ports sprang up along the coasts of West Africa, the Congo, and Angola, in India and Ceylon, in Brazil, Mozambique, and Malaya. In every trading settlement, little Catholic churches appeared. Spaniards in the New World. Meanwhile, Spaniards were following up the discoveries of Columbus. The red-headed Genoas made 3 more trips to the New World in a vain attempt to find an opening to the Asian mainland. On the second of these trips, he sailed with 17 ships bearing 1,500 men, and on Haiti he found gold, lots of it. After tracing the coast of Cuba, which he thought was southern China, Columbus set sail for Spain. In spite of an oath of secrecy, the magic word gold leaked out in the homeland, and the most violent gold rush in history was underway. Within 50 years of the first sighting of San Salvador, the Spaniards had plundered and conquered the New World from California to the tip of South America. The work of these courageous and brutal conquerors planted the word conquistadors in our vocabularies. By 1521, Hernando Cortez, equipped with horses, armor, and gunpowder, had destroyed the great Aztec Empire in Mexico, and by 1533, Francisco Pizarro had treacherously murdered Atahualpa, the monarch of the Incas, and brought the once mighty empire to its knees. All this, it is worth noting, happened in Martin Luther's lifetime. Charles V, who succeeded Ferdinand and Isabella and fell heir to the enormous wealth of the New World, was the same prince before whom Luther stood at the Diet of Worms. So while Charles struggled to keep Germany from slipping from his imperial grasp into Protestant hands, he found comfort in the gold-laden Spanish ships arriving from the West Indies and Mexico. This great global venture, however, was far from a breathless race for spices and gold. Deep within the hearts of the Portuguese merchants and the Spanish conquistadors was the zeal to extend the holy faith, the Roman Catholic faith of their fathers. Thus Dominicans, Franciscans, Augustinians, or Jesuits sailed on nearly every ship, as eager to convert the heathen as any captain to find a new port for trade. The sacrifices that many of these monks and friars made were extraordinary. The voyages at sea were risky. There were no furloughs. Out of 376 Jesuits who sailed for China between 1581 and 1712, 127 died en route. Thanks to such men, the 16th century, which saw Europe divided between Catholic and Protestant, also saw Christianity become Catholic in a new way. Just when it was painfully apparent that Catholic was no longer meaning united, it was universal in its mission to distant peoples. The Catholic Church was no longer confined to Europe. To avoid rivalry between Portugal and Spain, the Pope drew a line on the map from the North Pole to the south, just west of the Azores. All to the west of the line, he said, belonged to Spain. All to the east belonged to Portugal. That boundary explains why Brazil is a Portuguese-speaking country today, and the rest of Latin America is Spanish, and why no Spanish colonies appeared in Africa or Asia. By papal commission, the kings of Portugal and Spain were responsible to evangelize the lands conquered by their soldiers. The Roman Catholic Church expected these princes to send out missionaries and maintain them, whether in India or Peru. The monarchs had exclusive control over the missionaries and could name bishops to lead their newly baptized subjects. Thus, the underlying idea of this new missionary era was the extension of the concept of the Christian prince, the divinely appointed spiritual guide of his people, who was expected to remove all signs of idolatry from his lands and bring the subjects to the rule of Christ through the Holy Catholic Church. Given Spain's history of passionate devotion to Mother Church, developed over centuries of conflict with the Moors and Islam's military encroachment into Spain, the attitude of conquest of the Spanish in the New World was somewhat understandable. They assumed the same militant posture, the same superstition of a crusade. Cortez, the ruthless and skillful conqueror of Mexico, for example, was devoted to the Virgin Mary and always kept a statue of her on his person. He said his prayers and attended Mass daily. Upon one flag he carried was the cross, and upon the other a picture of the Virgin. Spain's first policy toward the indigenous population, called Encomienda, granted the Spanish colonists a number of natives who were supposed to toil in the mines and on the plantations of their captors. Further troubled, the natives received protection and instruction in the holy faith. Since the natives were considered guilty of gross crimes such as human sacrifice and idolatry, the Spanish felt duty-bound to stop these barbarities. Wars against these natives, then, in the minds of the Spanish, were righteous wars like Israel's against the godless Canaanites. In 1531, Bishop Zumarraga wrote from Mexico that they had destroyed more than 500 temples and 20,000 idols. One champion of the oppressed Native Americans was Bartholomew de las Casas, whose father had accompanied Columbus on that second voyage to the West Indies. At first, Bartholomew was as much a part of Christian imperialism as the next Spaniard in the West Indies or Mexico. In his mid-30s, however, he had a spiritual conversion and was ordained to the priesthood, the first such ordination in the New World. He began to feel pangs of conscience. In a sermon before the governor and leading settlers, he denounced the cruelties he saw around him. How could the Christian's God ordain brutality as an instrument of Christian conversion? Las Casas met widespread resistance. Many considered him a menace to New Spain. Some missionaries argued that wild and barbarous peoples could not come to the faith without the force necessary to show them the error of their ways. Some colonists insisted that Las Casas' opposition to encomienda would bring the colonists to economic ruin. Las Casas, however, persisted in his views. He made 14 trips across the Atlantic to urge Spanish leaders to consider another way to win the natives to the faith. Thanks in part to his appeals, Charles V, in 1542, issued a series of new laws, the Laws of the Indies, which softened the severity of the encomienda system and established the principle that natives had human rights too. Laws written in Spain, however, were one thing, practice in Mexico was another. In a famous debate held at Valladolid and the Yucatan Peninsula in 1550, Las Casas argued for the equality and freedom of the Native Americans. The only way to convert them, he said, was by peaceful preaching of the word and by the example of holy living. His opponent was a theologian, Jean Guinness de Sepulveda, who used Aristotle's argument that certain peoples are by nature born to slavery. The Spanish, he said, are as much above the Indians as man is above the ape. So despite Las Casas' best effort, Christian imperialism and slavery continued in the New World and hampered the spread of the gospel among the native population. Native Americans were eager enough to accept the Christian faith, but they were just as ready to abandon it. Between 1524 and 1531, the Franciscans baptized more than 1 million Mexicans. The practice of mass baptisms had the same effect as mass conversions in Northern Europe in the early Middle Ages, conversion because of coercion and conformity, and ignorance and superstition regarding Christian symbols. One well-known story has it that Cortez left the strictest instructions in one town that the citizens were to worship the Christian God and to care for one of his horses, which was lame. The natives faithfully obeyed. They fed the horse fruit and flowers until it died. They supposed that the horse and the Christian God were the same. Later, 2 Franciscans discovered that the natives had made an image of the horse and were worshipping it as the god of thunder and lightning. In the East, the Portuguese, like the Spanish, took the view that a Christian king was responsible to God for the spiritual welfare of his subjects. As a result, Goa, the center of the Portuguese commercial empire in the Orient, became a city of great Baroque churches. It had an archbishop who served as the representative of the authority of the Catholic Church throughout East Asia. The Portuguese authorities saw that no idolatry defiled the territory of their Christian king. The Portuguese faced a problem, however, that the Spanish never encountered in the Americas. They met highly developed civilizations and ancient religions far stronger than those of the Incas and Aztecs. These had a significant impact on the way many Christian missionaries approached Asian peoples. In India, Japan, and China, the policy of conversions by conquest was modified, and in some cases abandoned, in favor of the policy of adaptation. Jesuits in particular asked which Japanese, Chinese, and Indian customs were merely social or civil, as contrasted with those that were actually incompatible with Christian baptism. Profiles of Faith. Juan de Zumárraga, 1468 to 1548, was the first bishop, and then the first archbishop of Mexico. He embodies the ambivalent and complex history of colonial Christianity in the New World. Zumárraga brought a printing press to Mexico, the first in the Western Hemisphere, to print books for the instruction of the natives. Zumárraga also introduced reforms that opened up the lowest, non-sacramental orders of the priesthood to Native Americans. He helped found the University of Mexico. Like Bartolomé de las Casas, Zumárraga was known as a defender of the native population and campaigned against their exploitation by Spanish colonists. But he was also active in the persecution of heretics during the Inquisition. Appointed Apostolic Inquisitor of New Spain in 1536, he presided over the trial of 130 people, 13 of them Native Americans, the most infamous case being the chief Carlos Chichimetecatl, who was burned at the stake. Francis Xavier. The great pioneer of Christian missions in the Far East landed in Goa in 1542. Francis Xavier, 1506 to 1552, the associate of Ignatius Loyola, was commissioned as a papal legate in the service of the King of Portugal. Officials everywhere were obligated to assist him in his preaching mission. He found Goa, like most seaports, filled with riffraff from 1,000 shores, catering to lustful appetites. Xavier stayed in Goa only a few months, but in his short time he sparked something of a moral revolution in the port. Then, eager to break new ground, he turned his eyes to a more demanding field, the southern tip of India. In 1534, some fisherfolk living on the southeast coast had sought the protection of the King of Portugal. Robbers on land and sea had been making their lives miserable. The Portuguese agreed to protect them if they would accept Christian baptism. They did, but for the first 8 years of their Christian profession, they had no one to explain to them what this new faith involved. Xavier, the little dark man, stepped into that need. He went everywhere over the sand hills where the fishing villages were scattered. He would ring a handbell to call the villagers together and recite the Creed, the Lord's Prayer, the Ten Commandments, and the Rosary. When the villagers had learned the words and professed their belief in the Creed, Xavier would baptize them by the hundreds until his hands dropped from exhaustion. After 3 years, he had an organized church to pass on to his successors. The Paravars, as these fisherfolk were called, numbered perhaps 30,000. Since Christianity among them was restricted to one caste, they had little contact with their neighbors outside of trade. The church survived, therefore, only as an island in a sea of Hinduism. The Jesuits who followed Xavier, supported by their Portuguese authorities, gathered the Paravars to villages and slowly fashioned their lives according to Christian standards. No boat set out to fish on Sunday. A part of each Friday's catch went to the church. Gradually, all memory of a time when the Paravars were not Christian died away. The center of their life was the church, the one stone building around which their huts of palm leaf and thatch were clustered. Roman Catholics and Protestants unite in praising Francis Xavier's missionary zeal and personal charm. He was a man of his time, however. His years in India show that he at first shared the religious intolerance of his age. In a letter written on May 16, 1546, he told the King of Portugal that to have good Christians in India, the king should establish the Inquisition to suppress Muslims. The king granted his request, and the Inquisition continued in Goa until early in the 19th century. Xavier, however, had no intention of remaining in Goa or its region. His commission from Pope and King extended to the whole of the Far East. So in 1546, he moved on from India to Malaya. After nearly 2 years of ministry there, he was ready to find new worlds to conquer. He returned to Goa, and in 1549, with letters from the authorities, he sailed for Japan, the isle of Marco Polo's dreams. With 2 companions, Xavier landed on Japan on August 15th. It proved to be an opportune time. Governed only by federal barons and eager for trade with the outside world, Japan welcomed the strangers. Buddhism was out of favor, and no national religion presented opposition to the gospel. The years in Japan changed Xavier's view of Christian missions. During his earlier days in India, he had held the imperialist position. Heathenism had nothing in common with the true faith. Everything had to be leveled to the ground before anything Christian could be erected, the view of most missionaries in Latin America. In Japan, however, Xavier confronted a people with so many marks of nobility, he shifted his ground. He saw that while the gospel must transform and refine the Japanese, it need not discard as worthless everything in Japanese life and culture. Surrounded by the impressive ancient religions of the East, many Jesuits who followed Xavier developed a quality totally uncharacteristic to the Counter-Reformation: compromise and cultural expressions of religious matters. The Society of Jesus dominated the Christian mission in Japan until the end of the 16th century. Their work met with remarkable success. In 1577, one Jesuit wrote optimistically, "In 10 years all Japan will be Christian if we have enough missionaries." 2 years later, the Jesuits did establish a new town as a home for Christian converts. They called it Nagasaki. Before the end of the century, missionaries could count 300,000 converts, hundreds of churches, and 2 Christian colleges. Through the years, the Jesuits followed Xavier's lead and looked for ways to express the Christian faith in the culture of their hosts. They adapted to local customs and values in every way they could, and they moved as rapidly as possible to train Japanese leaders for the churches. Unfortunately, early in the 17th century, new rulers, fearful that foreign missionaries meant foreign invaders, launched a policy of persecution against Christians. Between 1614 and 1642, no fewer than 4,045 martyrs made the ultimate witness for Christ, some by sword, some by the stake, some by the boiling cauldron. The once thriving Christian work in Japan disintegrated. Only a remnant survived in the hills near Nagasaki. The door to China. In China, the story of Christian missions during this era parallels the saga in Japan. Once again, the visionary was Francis Xavier. After 2 years preaching in the streets of Japan, the intrepid Xavier decided it was time to enter China. He returned to Goa to secure the necessary authority, but on the passage east he found it difficult to get beyond Singapore. Hoping to smuggle himself into Canton, he took a ship as far as an island off the coast of southern China, where he fell ill and died, bringing to an end one of the most imaginative careers in missionary history. The year was 1552. The doorway to China that Xavier failed to find opened to his spiritual successors. In 1567, a small island off the coast of China, Macao, became a Portuguese colony. For years, however, entrance to China seemed impossible. The ruling Ming dynasty had no interest in contacts with the outside world. They considered the Chinese as the givers of culture, not the receivers. Confucianism was dominant in the empire, and the states, the family, and ethics were governed by its ideals and teachings. According to one story, Alessandro Valignani, a leader of the Jesuits in the Orient, looking out his window at Macao in 1579, cried out toward the Chinese coast, "Oh, rock, rock, when will you open?" Valignani recalled a 30-year-old Italian Jesuit teaching at the time in a seminary in Goa, Matthew Ricci, 1552 to 1610. Ricci had studied mathematics, astronomy, and cosmology in Rome before heading for India. He seemed unusually prepared for work among the Chinese. So Valignani called Ricci to Macao and placed the burden of China on his shoulders. Ricci's first task was to settle in Macao to learn the Chinese language and customs, and to wait for the rock to crack. In 1583, he secured permission to settle in Chongqing, the provincial capital. With their traditional respect for the scholar, the Chinese responded to a man who, dressed in the garb of a Mandarin, spoke their language and was able to open to them new fields of learning. Ricci made a map of the world for them and introduced them to the new science of the calendar. Such contacts proved useful for gaining toleration from the Chinese, but Ricci was convinced that China could never be won to the Christian faith from an outlying province. Step by step, he moved toward the capital of the empire. In 1600, he gained permission to enter Beijing itself. Ricci used 2 clocks to gain imperial favor. He brought the clocks with him as gifts to the emperor. They pleased the monarch very much. But when they ran down, the Chinese experts had no idea how to restart them. Ricci's skill in keeping them in working order gained the emperor's warm approval and allowed Ricci to remain in the capital for 10 years as an astronomer and mathematician. Under Ricci's wise guidance, the Jesuit mission in Beijing took root and flourished. A number of notable families and scholars were baptized. At the time of Ricci's death in 1610, the church numbered 2,000. Ricci's successor, Adam Scholl, carried the scholarly work to an even higher level. He won the admiration of the Chinese scholar class by accurately predicting the time of an eclipse of the moon and became the director of the Imperial Astronomical Service. In 1650, Scholl built a public church in Beijing and gained religious freedom for Christianity in the whole of the empire in 1657. At Scholl's death, there were almost 270,000 Christians in China. The Imperial Edict of Toleration in 1692 rewarded the service of the Jesuits on behalf of China in the imperial house, and thus an independent Chinese church approached reality. The Chinese mission, however, met with misfortune, this time not from external pressures, but from Dominican and Franciscan missionaries who argued that adaptation to Chinese ways had gone too far. Ricci had tried to avoid presenting Christianity to Chinese as something new. He refused to consider these advanced and religious people as atheists, so he taught that traditional Chinese devotion reached perfection in the Christian faith. The Lord of Heaven, whom the Chinese had so long revered, was God. Ricci contended that the reverence for ancestors, so common in China, was not a religious act but a social one, and therefore acceptable to Christians. Had adaptation gone too far? In 1631, a Franciscan and a Dominican arrived in Beijing and were shocked at what they found. The word used to translate the Christian Mass in the Jesuit Catechism was the Chinese character for the ceremony of ancestral worship. One night, the friars went in disguise to such a ceremony. They watched as Chinese Christians participated, and were scandalized by what they saw. They reported their experience to Rome, and the quarrel over their rights began. One pope approved, another disapproved, until after a century the whole mission in China fell into serious decline. The conflict between the policy of adaptation and the policy of conquest did not end with the 17th century. It continues today. Only conquest is usually in terms of economic control rather than political. But the age of global expansion was special in one sense, in opening up huge areas of the Earth's surface to the Christian message. It displayed some of the most innovative and creative missionary leaders found in any age. The Rule of the Saints, Chapter 31, Puritanism. In 1630, more than 400 immigrants gathered at Southampton, England, preparing to sail to the New World. John Catton, a distinguished minister who later joined them on the other side of the sea, preached a farewell sermon. His text for the occasion summed up the spirit of the great adventure. He took it from 2 Samuel 7, verse 10. "And I will provide a place for my people Israel, and will plant them so that they can have a home of their own and no longer be disturbed. Wicked people will not oppress them any more, as they did at the beginning." Cotton declared that, like the ancient Israelites, these immigrants were God's chosen people, headed for the land he had promised and prepared. In this new land, they would be able to labor undisturbed for the glory of God. There you have a snapshot of Puritanism, the Bible, the covenanted people of God, and their divine mission in the world. While it endured as a distinct historic movement between 1560 and 1660, Puritanism provided for Christians of every generation a model of the Christian faith as a decisive commitment to Jesus Christ and how that life of the soul expresses itself in the public arena, in a new nation governed by the truths of the gospel of the Bible. Puritanism, new life and new world. In more recent centuries, Christians have renewed from time to time the Puritan experience of the soul, a type of piety arising from the purely gracious work of God in the heart of the believer. But no later Christian movement has had the vision of or the opportunity to apply the law of God to the life of a nation. In these modern times marked by zeal for individual rights and sexual freedom, Puritan has come to refer to a person who is self-righteous, hyper-religious, or sexually repressed, one who does his best to keep people from having fun. This view of the Puritan as a moss-backed moralist captured popular thinking in the backlash against Victorian stuffiness. Early in the 20th century, American journalist H.L. Mencken summed up the popular image in his quip that Puritanism was the haunting fear that someone, somewhere, may be happy. But is that fair? What was Puritanism originally? Whatever it was not stiff and straight-laced. It stood for change and a new day in England. The first Puritans had little confidence in traditional religion. Their plans for a new England arose from a deep conviction that spiritual conversion was crucial to Christianity. This rebirth separated Puritans from the mass of humanity, even other Christians who had not been so reborn, and endowed them with the privileges and duties of the elect of God. The Church may prepare a person for this experience, and after it the Church may guide them. But the heart of the experience, the reception of the grace of God, is beyond the Church's control. In its quest to reshape England, the Puritan movement passed through three rather clearly marked periods. First, under Queen Elizabeth, 1558 to 1603, it tried to purify the Church of England along the lines of Calvin's Geneva. Second, under James I and Charles I, 1603 to 1642, they resisted the claims of the monarchy and suffered under royal pressures designed to force conformity to a high church style of Christianity. Third, during England's Civil War and Oliver Cromwell's rule, 1642-60, Puritans had a chance to shape the national church in England, but failed because of their internal dissensions. Such an outline suggested, as it should, that Puritanism had a public side as well as a personal side. It began with an individual's experience of the redeeming grace of God, but moved on to stress the mission of the elect and the world, the shaping of society according to biblical principles. And its emphasis on the interior life of the saint, Puritanism was a taproot of later evangelical Christianity, with its born-again message, and its stress on a disciplination under God and His laws. It contributed significantly to the national character of the American people. Puritanism, England's Second Reformation, first appeared during the reign of Elizabeth. It had a new style of preaching, a message aimed not at the head, but at the heart. This spiritual brotherhood, as William Haller, a Puritan authority, once called it, included names like Greenham, Rogers, Chatterton, and Dodd. Many of these first Puritans had been Protestant exiles of the reign of Bloody Mary, 1553 to 1557. Hounded out of their homeland by their Catholic queen, these Protestant sympathizers had gone to Geneva and mobilized as a vanguard for a fresh Calvinist assault on England. The military image is appropriate, for in the late 1550s, Geneva had become a center for international subversion, sending out cadres of students inflamed with a passion to overthrow Catholicism in their homelands. In 1560, John Knox was successful in Scotland. The English reformers hoped for as much in their own country. Queen Mary's death and the crowning of Elizabeth appeared to be an invitation to the exiles to return to England. They took up their work, still convinced that the Bible gave specific guidance for the ordering of personal life, the structuring of the church, and the regulation of society. They discovered that the most explosive political issue was the authority to choose ministers for the churches. The Puritans wanted the selection of their ministers to rest with the people. The Queen insisted that the appointment of bishops was a responsibility of rulers. As long as Elizabeth lived, she allowed these Puritan dogs to bark so long as they did not bite. The Queen's tolerant policy permitted them to complain about prayers from a book and special clothing for ministers, and the sign of the cross during baptisms, just about any practice that looked like Roman Catholicism. But she would not hear of their control of the church. She allowed them to lecture for hours on the importance of preaching and the biblical office of elder, but she made sure the Church of England remained firmly in the hands of bishops and therefore in the control of the crown. A people of the book. The Puritan zeal to purify the Church of England was fired by eager reading of popular versions of the Bible. Chief among these was the Geneva Bible. The name came from the fact that it was the work of several of those English exiles in Geneva during the reign of the Catholic Mary. Miles Coverdale, who had translated the first complete Bible into English in 1535, was in this group. Once printed during the early years of Elizabeth's reign, the Geneva Bibles numbered verses, lucid prose, approved scholarship, extensive prologues, and marginal notes gave it wide popularity, until its eventual replacement by the King James Version, 1611. It was the most widely distributed Bible in English, and was the one the Puritans carried to America. The Puritans, however, had more than their Geneva Bibles. They had a sense of destiny, a vision of God's purpose among individuals and nations. The idea that the Almighty moves in the affairs of people is traceable, to be sure, to the Bible. But the concept that the pilgrimage of God's faithful people spanned the centuries and led at last to England was from another book, John Foxe, in his highly popular Book of Martyrs, planted this idea in the minds of English believers. Like the Geneva Bible, the Book of Martyrs was a product of English exile during the reign of Bloody Mary. Foxe marshaled account after account of the suffering of faithful Protestants who dared to die, if need be, for the triumph of God's kingdom. According to Foxe, this trail of martyrs led to the shores of England and to the reign of Mary. The conclusion seemed clear. God had a special place for the English people in his worldwide plan of redemption. The influence of the Book of Martyrs proved enormous. Generation after generation of English people saw history and read their Bibles through Foxe's eyes. Aside from the Bible, his book probably did more to shape the mind of the English than any other single volume. Less than half a century after Foxe's death, Puritans carried his work and his philosophy of history, along with their English Bibles, across the Atlantic into the American wilderness. Thanks to their study of the Bible and their reading of the Book of Martyrs, Puritans came to think of themselves as God's new Israel. Most Christians in the 17th century believed that the Bible was God's inspired word and revealed will. The key to the Puritan view of the Bible and of themselves lay in their understanding of the fundamental biblical concept called covenant. The Puritans, like the ancient Hebrews, believed that spiritual contracts exist between God and man. The most important was the covenant of grace. This was a spiritual contract by which true Christians were bound to God. While they believed that God sovereignly elected individuals to salvation, they also held that anyone by personal faith in Jesus Christ could be added to the covenanted company. By grace, believers became God's people, and He their God. This near bound obligated the saint to walk in all of God's ways made known in His Word. On the other hand, it opened the Scriptures as a deeply felt source of spiritual and emotional strength, a fountain of that rugged determination for which the Puritans became famous. To live within the covenant of grace was to live within the light of the Word and according to the plan of Almighty God. Conflicts with the king. In 1603, the long reign of Queen Elizabeth came to a close when she died without an heir. James VI of Scotland, the son of Mary Queen of Scots, became James I of England, united for the first time the two kingdoms. Any Puritan hopes for James's bringing Presbyterianism from Scotland to England were dashed early. He welcomed a chance to deal with bishops. Rule in Scotland had been a constant struggle with Presbyterian ministers. A Scottish presbytery, he said, agrees with monarchy as well as God and devil. At the Hampton Court Conference in 1604, some leading Puritans had a chance to present to the king their ideas for change in the Church of England. But James, who had an inflated view of his own intelligence, dismissed most of their opinions rather rudely. On only one point did he consent to the demands of the Puritans. He was willing to commission a new translation of the Scriptures. From this decision came what we call the King James Version of the Bible. On nothing else of significance would the king yield to the Puritans. The ceremonies, the prayer book, and the bishops of the Church of England were going to stay. And if the Puritans did not like it, they would still submit, or, said the king, I will drive them out of the land. or else worse. With that threat, the conference broke up. James's initial contact with Parliament was equally tactless. In his first address to the body, he defended the divine right of kings. The state of monarchy, he said, is the supremest thing upon earth. For kings are not only God's lieutenants upon earth, and set upon God's throne, but even by God himself they are called gods. Sweeping aside English institutions and ignoring the mood of the English people, James made it plain that he meant to be an absolute monarch. In 1611, he dissolved Parliament. For the next 10 years, ruled England without it. Thus the leaders of the Puritans and the advocates of parliamentary authority in England tended to merge in their resistance to royal power. Some of the Puritan movement, however, grew impatient for change in the church. Shortly after the Hampton Court Conference, little groups of believers began to meet for worship as they felt the Bible taught them, not according to bishops and prayer books. They were determined to obey God even if their nation's leaders were not. We call this movement separatism because the groups were intent on leaving, separating from the Church of England. One of these groups was in the village of Scrooby in northern England. Another was not far away at Gainsborough. By 1608, both congregations had moved to Holland for safety and freedom of worship. The Scrooby group settled at Leyden. The Gainsborough group found a home in Amsterdam. After 10 years in Holland, Scrooby congregation, led by Pastor John Robinson, realized that their children were growing up out of touch with their homeland, forgetting even their native tongue. But to return to England meant to return to the evil ways of English society. They had heard of the English colony in Virginia planted in 1607. Perhaps the new continent of America was their answer. It was a daring thought, full of unknown terrors, but a small number was willing to try. These returned to England, where they were joined by another group of like-minded pilgrims. In September 1620, a company of about 100 souls set sail from Plymouth in a ship called the Mayflower. In November, the crew sighted the rocky shore of New England. The Pilgrim Fathers stepped ashore at what we call Plymouth, Massachusetts. Meanwhile, the second group in Holland was on another pilgrimage. These separatists had been given aid by local Mennonites. We know little about their association, but we know they exchanged confessions to compare doctrines. The pastor of the separatists, a Cambridge graduate named John Smith, studied his Greek New Testament and discovered that the practice of baptizing babies never appeared in its pages. If babies were not included in the covenant of grace, only believers in Jesus Christ, then shouldn't churches be constituted by confession of faith rather than ties of covenants? Smith and 40 members of the Amsterdam congregation answered yes and were baptized upon the profession of their personal faith in Jesus Christ. Smith baptized himself by pouring water on himself and then baptized the other 40 members of the congregation. The year was 1609. Thus, they constituted the first English Baptist church. Attack upon the Lord's anointed. Separation from the Church of England, however, was far too drastic for the vast majority of Puritans. They remained faithful for some alternative to schism. All grounds for hope in earthly rulers appeared to vanish in 1625, however, when Charles I followed his father James to the English throne. James had his theories about the divine right of kings. Charles was determined to put them into practice. No law and no parliament would restrain him. To make matters worse in the eyes of the Puritans, his wife, Henrietta Maria, was a French Roman Catholic princess. To enforce his will upon the Puritans, Charles found a ready servant in Archbishop William Laud, who believed that God had ordained bishops to govern his church. Led by the Archbishop, an Episcopal party arose to resist the Puritans. With the king's support, they reintroduced stained glass windows, crosses, even crucifixes. They elevated the communion table and called it an altar, and they insisted that worship be conducted according to the Book of Common Prayer and no other. Laud's high-minded and high-handed policy drove some Puritans toward separatism and others across the Atlantic to America. Within 10 years after Laud became Archbishop, 20 towns and churches sprung up in Massachusetts Bay. In all, 16,000 people, including the 400 who heard John Cotton's farewell at Southampton. The spark that ignited open conflict came when Charles tried to force his high church brand of Anglican religion on the Presbyterian Scots. He insisted that they conduct their worship services from the Book of Common Prayer. John Milton called it the skeleton of a Mass book. That is the way the Scots took it. They rose in opposition to the move and joined in a National League of Covenant. To defend their church, they dared to take up arms against their king. To put an army in the field, Charles was forced to convene Parliament, which he, like his father, had tried to ignore for over a decade. Once Parliament assembled, conflicting loyalties led to a Royalist party and a Parliamentary party. The Parliamentarians, clearly a majority, were agreed on the broad Puritan principles, but were divided over the form of the church. On the other hand were Presbyterians. On the other were Independents, or Congregationalists, united in their hatred of Archbishop Laud. The Parliamentarians succeeded in bringing him to trial and seeing him beheaded. When Charles tried to punish the leaders of this opposition, civil war erupted. The Royalist members of Parliament left London to join the forces defending the king. The Parliament was free at last to institute the reform of the Church the Puritans had always wanted. It called to Westminster scores of Puritan theologians and assigned to them the creation of a new form of worship, a new form of church government for the Church of England. The Westminster Assembly, meeting from 1643 to 1646, produced the Westminster Confession of Faith to replace the 39 Articles, as well as a larger and shorter catechism for use in the churches. These writings alone made the Assembly one of the most significant gatherings of Christian history. Many Orthodox Presbyterians and Congregationalists use these doctrines to this day. In 1645, Parliament ordered the creation of presbyteries throughout the land and the election of elders for the churches. The system, however, was never fully enforced because Parliament never ruled the entire country, and even when the king was defeated, the army, not Parliament, wielded the power. The rule of the saints. The war itself brought forward one of the towering figures in Christian history, a country gentleman named Oliver Cromwell, 1599 to 1658. As a colonel in the parliamentary forces, he proved to be a military genius. His regiment, known as Ironsides, was never defeated, in part because Cromwell instilled in his soldiers a sense of discipline and Christian mission. The rise of Cromwell's star brought him in time to the leadership of the new model army, a force of 21,000 soldiers, who considered their role in English history a call from God. In their eyes, the war was a Puritan crusade against enemies of righteousness. The just end sanctified force as a means. That is why the army prayed before battles and plunged into conflict singing Christian hymns. By the end of 1646, Cromwell's army had forced Charles to surrender. For the next 2 years, the king tried to play his enemies against each other: the Scots, the Presbyterians, who controlled Parliament, and the Independents, who dominated the army. He succeeded in splitting Parliament and making a secret alliance with the Scots, but fierce resentment against Charles broke out in the army. In 1648, war erupted anew. This time, the army defeated the allies of the king, and the Presbyteries were purged from the House of Commons. This so-called Rump Parliament, a tool of the army, created a high court of justice to try the king. In January 1649, Charles was led to the scaffold in front of the royal palace of Whitehall in London, and before an assembled throng, he was executed. It was a brash move, a sure sign of Puritanism's ultimate fall from power, for it gave the Royalists their own martyr. Centuries of English royal tradition could not be erased, not even by the saints of God. Shortly after the king's execution, a portrait appeared, allegedly depicting his last hours. He was kneeling at a table. On it rested the Bible. The royal crown lay on the floor. In the king's right hand was a crown of thorns. His eyes were lifted to a crown of glory above. The widely distributed picture and its attendant sentiment unmasked Puritanism as no battlefield could. It changed Charles from a king executed by opponents of royalty to a martyr persecuted by fanatics. That is how many of the English chose to remember the Puritans. For the moment, however, the army of saints had their say. After abolishing the House of Lords, the House of Commons proclaimed England a republic, the Commonwealth. But in 1653, the army, still distrusting Parliament, overthrew the Commonwealth and set up a form of government called the Protectorate. Cromwell held the office of Lord Protector, virtually a military dictator of England. The Lord Protector tried to achieve a religious settlement for the nation by granting liberty to a wide variety of Christian groups growing on the religious landscape: Presbyterians, Independents, Baptists, Quakers, Levelers, and others. Unfortunately, he found the task impossible, and the last 3 years of his life were filled with disappointment and trouble. When he died in 1658, the rule of the saints in Old England died with him. Within 2 years, the country welcomed the return of the monarchy, and with the king, the office of bishop. Far across the Atlantic, however, tens of thousands of saints were firmly settled in New England, where they were devoutly erecting the kingdom of God in the American wilderness.